Hi, everybody. It's Steve Napier. Welcome to the Circle of Brilliance. We're going to start today by exploring a little add-on topic to the discussions that we've been having in recent sessions on conflict and harmony on the change grid. And it has to do with something that Brian brought up before we started the recording, and that's about tolerance. How does tolerance come into play when we're looking about conflict and when we're thinking about how people handle conflict, or when they decide to intervene in a conflict? So where does tolerance come into play? So Brian, you want to set the stage a little bit more?
Yeah, I asked that question because I was thinking from the last call that those attentional faculties of the brain, like our media, that helps us to mediate conflict, those are always based on like historical analysis. So it's always based on the past. So I just assumed that what I was reflecting on is everyone probably has some kind of threshold when it comes to what they can and can't tolerate. And those who, have a high or low tolerance level probably just end up blowing up when it comes to conflict, so they're probably like, there's extremes that they experience. And it gets back to that point that when it arises, we're probably not actually talking about the conflict, but based on something in the past that was triggered.
Yeah. Yep. So anyone want to throw some thoughts out about tolerance? How does it come into play? Where might it live on the change grid? Anyone?
My only comment on the tolerance topic is I think tolerance has a lot to do with emotional intelligence.
Okay.
And if somebody is, I guess, more tolerant people that I've met seem to be more emotionally intelligent.
Okay. All right.
That makes sense.
Yep. It does. David, what were you going to add?
Well, I was going to say it's a mid-grid kind of energy to me, maybe a little mid to out grid in the, what is that, the amiable expressive?
The amiable
driver.
The amiable driver right here.
Right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, that's kind of what I think.
Yep. Good. Anyone else want to throw anything in? Yep.
Yeah, years ago I did some D&I work for a company called Pro Group, and they had a contract with Microsoft, but they had developed something called the tolerance scale. So when Brian mentioned that, that's the first place my mind went. And in that model, they do not talk about tolerance. There's 5 levels in it. So level 1 at the bottom is repulsion, then avoidance, then tolerance, then acceptance, and then appreciation. And so the model says that when trying to create an inclusive environment, that you really want people feeling like they are at level 4 and 5, that they are accepted and appreciated and not tolerated, and certainly below tolerance. And what's interesting when we would roll that model out is folks would say, well, listen, Tim, I don't discriminate against folks. It doesn't really matter to me what the difference is. I can tolerate anyone as long as they come in and do what the company pays us to do. And so, and I'd ask, so listen, let's say that when we're finished today, you go back to the office and you begin working with your team, and about an hour into it, you make a discovery, and that is that you've discovered that your team tolerates you as their leader.
Yeah. There's a cause for celebration.
And so, trying to get people to understand that tolerating someone really does not make them feel full and complete in that relationship is really what we began to discuss. And so I don't know so for me, where they would fall on the where they may plot out wouldn't necessarily be in a favorable position.
Yeah, depending on the dynamic that's going on. So this is actually a very interesting thing. And while you were chatting, I did a quick Google about the interpersonal tolerance scale. There is a lot of work out there specifically on the subject of tolerance, and where tolerance has both a positive and a negative sort of I'm going to say impact, I guess, on your own life and the lives of those that are around you. So sometimes being tolerant is a good thing, but other times tolerance is actually further evidence of a bigger problem that's going on.
Yeah.
So that's all very interesting, very interesting. Okay, as to the subject of where does tolerance live on the change grid, I think David's observation is probably a good place to begin. I would suggest to all of you that, first of all, if you just look at the four energies, expressive, amiable, analytical, and driver, I would say two of these tend to be more tolerant than the other two. So which of the four energies would you say seems to be more inherently tolerant? So if I said tolerance is about accepting things, putting up with stuff, not really amiable. I would say amiables are probably likely to use tolerating as a normal way of dealing with whatever happens to be going around them. So they have a high tolerance. And we could talk about how they've developed that level of tolerance over on. But and again,
analytical is probably the other one.
Analyticals, and now their reasons for tolerating could be very different. So, I mean, as an analytical, I can tell you very often I tolerate all sorts of nonsense and foolishness I'm encountering in my life because I really, A, don't think it's worth the energy to fix these people, and B, I don't think they could handle the fix. So you just gotta go like, whatever. So that's kind of like when tolerance meets apathy, or the tolerance that comes along with apathy. Where in grid, I think people are tolerating things maybe out of an insecurity that if they were to speak up, if they were to challenge something, they would be very quickly perhaps shot down. Or could even get far more manipulative than that. So where I think the people that are outgrid and upgrid, they don't tend to tolerate all that much. What would they rather do? Rather than tolerate, what do?
They might rebel.
Yeah, they may very well rebel. We know the person who's very far outgrid is more than ready for a fight and often likes to stir one up. And the people that are upgrid are already in a situation that feel greatly out of control. They don't really think they can handle anymore. And so their tolerance has already been well exceeded.
T, what tolerance conjures up for me in this is putting up with.
Putting up with, yep.
Yeah.
And so, I think that if we want to look at the extremes, I think it's fair to say that in all four danger zones, tolerance becomes its own problem. And I forget which among you brought that all up. I think that was Tim, who said that, how would you like to know that your greatest accomplishment in life is that people find you tolerable? So it's hysterical. I want a t-shirt made that just says I'm tolerable.
Exactly.
People find me tolerable. So, but I think people in their outgrid danger zone, for them, tolerance, or in fact, in their case, the lack of tolerance becomes an issue. And upgrid, I get it, they're in a serious situation because they can't tolerate the situation anymore. In grid, their tolerance is more of a self-preservation sort of an approach, and down grid, the tolerance is one that just says, I'm no longer going to put energy into whatever it is that goes on. So I think we could say that there is a problem with tolerance at all four extremes. Are we in agreement on that? Or you guys want to throw anything else out about the extremes? No? Yep, go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I definitely would say that that's where one would live on the scale if they're in that, if they're at that level of tolerance.
Yeah.
And in fact, it may even, depend, like you said, depending upon the scenario, but I can think of scenarios where they would certainly downgrid in the danger zone.
Yeah.
Because they're just not aware of the impact that they're having on those relationships.
Right, by not speaking up, by tolerating it, by whatever. Yeah, because down grid, that silence allows things to continue that may not be in anyone's best interest. So isn't that something? I mean, to be that far down grid, you have awareness, at least you think you have a very high level of ability, a very low level of challenge. And so in theory, you should be able to speak up in concrete, understandable sorts of ways to fix whatever it is. But regardless, all four extremes have got their own problem with tolerance. So where does tolerance become more of a beneficial, positive kind of a thing? Well, as Boris pointed out, you would think that a certain level of tolerance comes along with emotional intelligence. And so right there, we know we're looking kind of at these four areas on the change grid. And I can talk about how tolerance might actually come into play for each of those four different subquadrants. I could also say that maybe as we move inside of the green circle in from any direction, tolerance becomes kind of a de facto part of this area on the change grid as well. And maybe that's because I think that if we are in a conflict sort of a situation, or we're together to explore, resolve issues, solve problems, do those things that are necessary, I can see that we have to be willing to accept one another a bit more, be willing to accept one another's viewpoints and input. And so that all to me starts to still tip its toe into tolerating, if you will, differences among peoples, differences among values, differences among whatever. And if anything, maybe even tolerate isn't the right word. Maybe inside of the green circle, we're more not tolerant of it, but accepting of it, maybe even celebrating that these differences exist. So what do you
Could it
guys
be
think about that?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Could it be unjudging?
I think that inside of the middle of the change grid, there isn't this judgment of one another. At least there may be work to be done, and judgments need to ultimately be made before someone proceeds in a particular direction. But I would say these people are not judgmental, and certainly not judgmental about one another.
Where does tolerance end or begin? And I'm just thinking of people that feel powerless, helpless, hopeless, and they're putting up with stuff. They're tolerating it, but it's not by choice. It's certainly not celebrating.
Nope, that's
So,
Ingrid. That's
yeah,
Ingrid.
but there are so many people that don't feel that choice, that they're putting up with it because they don't feel empowered enough to,
Yeah.
Where do you see that fine line?
That's, as you've described it, well, I think it's a continuum, honestly. And I think that it's a radial trend. I would say that how do we put this? Healthy tolerance occurs at the center of the change grid. And as you move away from the center of the change grid, as you move away from the center in any direction, that whole relationship that you have with tolerance becomes increasingly problematic. So it's a different problem downgrid than it is outgrid, upgrid, ingrid. It's different problems with your relationship with tolerance, but this is where tolerance might become an unhealthy way of thinking, being, doing, whatever ing you want to plug in.
Wouldn't there be a danger if somebody is Ingrid and putting up, that one day they may go postal and they go from 0 to 100 in a flash?
Right. And now we're really talking about that whole victimization sort of things. So when you think about someone who has been abused in any or all varieties, they are ultimately being pushed deeper and deeper ingrid to a more and more, an increasingly insignificant state of being. Well, in order for that to happen, I've always said this, and I don't want to minimize the experience of a victim, but at a certain point you have to ask, what is the victim's role in their victimization? And it goes back to this tolerance. They become codependent. They make excuses for people's unacceptable behaviors. They start to wonder if they are the ones that are actually the true cause of that behavior. And so, you know, at a certain point in time, that whole belief system becomes very toxic. Very damaging to them. And it's not just someone doing it to them. At a certain point, they start doing it to themselves. And so we'd have to go to the dark side of the change grid to see where the in-grid danger zone becomes a neighbor of the out-grid danger zone. But to the point you've just described, this whole idea that these individuals, when they finally have the awareness that they have been putting up with it, they have been tolerating it, they have in many ways invited it to come into and remain in their reality. Now I can certainly see how they would go ballistic, how they would go postal, but they're not doing that new set of behaviors while they're in grid. They've moved into the out-grid danger zone. And that's why very often in the evolution of abusive generational abuse, the abused becomes the abuser, who then, you know, ultimately sets a new generation, a new cycle of that going around and around and around. And by the way, that's also institutional. Don't just think that happens at the individual level. That's institutional too.
So they play the multiple roles in terms of that drama triangle.
Oh. Well, yeah, I mean, you do wonder if the relative positions on the drama triangle don't keep rotating among the individuals.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I'm sure there's been plenty of evidence of that, but that's a very common thing for the victim to ultimately become the perpetrator. And in a way, it starts off as being revenge, but it could still lead to, well, you know, I'm not a psychotherapist. A couple of you on the call are, so you could explain this, but they're going to duplicate what was modeled for them. They're just going to direct it to somebody else. Mm-hmm. And so they don't know healthy ways of coping with whatever. And so if they were beaten, they're likely to beat. If they were screamed at, they're likely to scream. These are the behaviors that was modeled. Those of you that are clinical psychologists on the call.
Well, I guess I wouldn't say I'm a clinical psychologist, but it's what Jung says, what we're unaware of will manifest itself as fate. And so that's these unconscious patterns will keep repeating until we have that awareness.
Yeah. Isn't that interesting? Say that again. What's the quote?
What we're unaware of will manifest itself as fate.
What we're unaware of will manifest itself as fate.
Right. So we project the unconsciousness constantly into waking life, repeating these patterns.
Right.
And see, that's why I asked this question about tolerance, because again, as I was looking at the attentional faculties in the brain, where we mediate conflict, like there's the subjective and the objective, that pathway, if you will, is always just like the emotions. It's going to line itself up with what is familiar. So, you know, whatever you rehearsed in your mind, whether it's real or not, whatever you made a habit, all those things are going to come up first because the brain wants to conserve and preserve energy. So it made sense that, to me, something that Jonathan Haidt said in his book, Coddling of the American Mind, he said, we make such horrible assumptions about other people's moral compass.
Well, say that last part again, Brian. We kind of lost you there.
It says we make horrible assumptions about other people's moral compass. And so imagine conflict, and you know, you're in an argument or a heated debate with someone, and we're judging them without any reference point of their moral, you know, their moral compass.
Yeah, it's interesting that you brought that up because someone somehow or another, maybe it was on Facebook, but I stumbled across a little self-test you can take. It was 8 values. And there's these like 4 different value scales that you're looking at, but ultimately it tells you whether you have a tendency to be more liberal or conservative and more, you know, it's one of those kinds of things. Because I had brought up that I think a great deal of the conflict between people and with one another about political beliefs, and that is that we are approaching that from a different set of values. And if we all just understood that I'm not right and you're wrong, and you're not right and I'm wrong, we have different value systems. And if we can understand one another's respective value systems, it's easier to understand how and why. Oops, don't know what that noise was, but we can understand how and why we are all, thinking and feeling and doing whatever it is we think and feel and do. So seek to understand before you seek to be understood. I guess it's going to go back to that. To bring this to bring this tolerance thing to kind of a point on the change grid, I'm going to say something. No, I do not want an extended warranty. Yeah. The only person I know who's from Chapel Hill, North Carolina is Peter, and he's on this call. So, okay. All right.
That same call, T.
Is that it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. I do not want an extended warranty. Okay. I'm going to propose something as far as how tolerance lays on the change grid. Then I want you guys to tell me if you think it has merit or if you think I'm missing something. I would suggest that tolerance appears on the two resulting axes. So tolerance parallels tension, and tolerance also parallels risk. So that would mean that if I put them as a continuum, I would say that from downgrid to upgrid, the continuum would be that very far downgrid, you are hyper tolerant, and very far upgrid, you are hypo tolerant. So both of those extremes are problematic. So somewhere in the middle, you end up with kind of like I'm going to say balanced, or just kind of a middle of the road sort of level of tolerance. Similarly, between in-grid and out-grid, you also have a relationship based on the amount of risk orientation you have, or the amount of drive you have around something. We know that people that are very far in-grid are risk intolerant, and the people that are very far out-grid are very risk tolerant, so much in fact that they routinely create risk where it does not otherwise exist, purely to make things more interesting. So I would say that the people that are very far in grid are hyper tolerant, and the people that are very far out grid are hypo tolerant. And that would mean that somewhere in the middle, there is this middle of the road balanced kind of tolerance that would exist. So far, do you guys agree with how I've mapped that out?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so again, hyper, hypo, don't care which one you pick, it comes with its own set of problems. So, and if I'm hyper, hypo tolerant of tension versus hyper, hypo tolerant of risk, now we're getting to the two dimensions we need to make the distinctions as we've already described them for what happens in each of these danger zones. What that would actually mean is that in the middle of the change grid is where we all experienced a reasonable balanced amount of tolerance. And that what that would imply is that we are almost saying that tolerance is part of an ideal state of being human. But how does that tolerance express itself? How does that tolerance come into play? And that's why I'm thinking, like, I think, and Tim, you can unmute if you want to chime in on this. I think before, or any of you that do work on mediation, anything like that, facilitation, I think that in order to facilitate a conflict between two other people, they first have to be willing to tolerate a certain amount of difference that's going on. And that tolerance, maybe we'd like it to become more about respect one another as coming from different sorts of places. So no longer am I tolerating people who are different than I am. I can actually understand them a little bit more. That's why I found that 8 values, a little test that I did, to be very eye-opening, because if I know what your values are, as long as I see you as behaving in accordance with your values, I'm going to view your actions differently than if I think your values don't match my own, if that makes sense. So having different values, I'll give you one example of this. Someone brought up a discussion with me about the idea about the US having the greatest amount of healthcare, and that healthcare should be a commercial enterprise, that it's part of capitalism, it's part of all this kind of stuff. And I said, I'm a big believer in capitalism. I think that's really great. I just think my values, it is morally wrong for someone to profit off of the illness of another human being. So in my values, that's what's driving this belief that we need to very much overhaul healthcare in the United States. We need to very much be looking into ways, because the thought that illness would actually bankrupt the sick in order to enrich another group of people is, to me, morally repulsive. And so, but talk about any other kind of enterprise, and I'm likely to say, yeah, we should be out there, make that profit, do whatever it is you really want to do. I don't care. But illness. So I think that then when people kind of go, oh no, they understand that our value is, and why is that our value? Because a lot of you will relate to this. We are independent business people. We don't have any kind of company sponsored health insurance. We don't even have the possibility of having any kind of group health insurance. We all have to pay for it directly out of pocket. And I've shared with you before that our insurance premiums were close to $30,000 per year. And that was with a $15,000 deductible. So, and we made too much money to qualify for any of the subsidies. And so forget a super serious illness. How quickly do you think an illness could wipe somebody out? Well, to me, that is morally wrong. And that's why I would say, look, while I may have different beliefs about a lot of other things, I put a very high value on the fact that illness is something that needs to be, what do I want to say, funded differently than it's currently being funded. All right, now you guys might have a different viewpoint, but hearing my value around it and where that value comes from, does that make my difference I might have with you a little bit more understandable, a little bit more tolerable, and it's easier to respect the fact that, you know what, if I was in a situation, I'd think the exact same way.
Yes, I call that the alt middle.
Yeah, go ahead, Brian, first, and then Tim.
I call that the alt middle. So in other words, you move away from what we see now in the extreme. We see a lot of absolutism, right? Where people have definite beliefs and attitudes about things. I go through this all the time when I'm talking to patients about the vaccine. And so they have this absolute from wherever they got their information from about why they should not get the vaccine and why it's not useful.
Yeah.
And so I'm not trying to convince them either way. I just simply meet them in the middle. Some information that they can go and ponder, you know, and contemplate that information, and then
that's right.
That and they come back and they say, you know, I never thought about it that way.
That's right.
So I was explaining to them how, like the Delta variant, how infectious it is. And this patient had chicken pox before, and so I was explaining to them that chicken pox on a viral vector is a number 9 and Delta is number 7.
Yep.
So when I said that to them, they said, oh, okay, I didn't understand that.
Right, right. Because God, you know, God forbid we would talk to someone whose expertise is infectious disease to find out that there's nothing that is more contagious than chickenpox. And if you can get close to chickenpox on that scale, okay, you're going to get it one way or another. So sooner or later, it's coming for you. So this is I guess my whole point about the whole idea about trying to move the, oh, Tim, I'm sorry, you were going to share something. Go right ahead. Yep.
Yeah, I was just going to say that the difficulty with tolerance is that it does not do a very good job of conveying shared value. And that people can, one of the things we talk about in our work is recognizing that people can tell when they are being tolerated. And in the workplace, when that's the case, it becomes a distraction from them giving their talent to the business, because they're focused on what they have recognized as the fact that they are not accepted and appreciated, but they're merely being tolerated. And depending upon the nature of the work, like for instance, if I'm in a nuclear power plant or something like that, where there's a big issue around safety, that can be problematic when people are distracted from what they should be focused on.
Exactly.
So, T, can I just say one quick thing? It
Sure.
seems like what you did was to create, I see tolerance as being two separate circles.
Okay.
And what you're trying to do is to create some overlap.
Okay.
And that's the step that you described is the first step to there being some overlap in the circles where there can be tolerance, because separate circles have no tolerance for each other.
Oh, interesting. And so if we went to, this goes back to our conflict thing we've been talking about, depending on where the two respective parties are on the change grid, I wonder what happens to the world of the concept of tolerance, So it may get thrown completely out the door. Yeah.
Well, that's part of our role as advisors and facilitators and consultants to demonstrate the skills necessary to create some tolerance.
Yep.
Because you can't have any discussion without tolerance.
It can't begin, that's certainly for sure. And that's what I was going to say, is that as we get inside of the change grid, in fact, how about this? Even the willingness to step inside of that circle. So this is where the mediation might occur. This is where the discussions, all that stuff might actually occur inside of the circle. I have to I'm tolerant as I walk in there, and it's a healthy thing. I'm willing to do that. But when I go to the exact center of the change grid, I think that it's no longer about tolerance. Now it becomes a matter of respect, because there's an understanding. Now, do we know everything? Absolutely not. To be in the center of the change grid, you're acknowledging that as much as you know, there is still just as much left to learn. Or as challenging as you find a situation, there is still half of all possibilities, even greater so. So you really have this appreciation for this middle that you're actually in. And that's what I like about when I'm in the center of the change grid, I'm not tolerating anybody or anything anymore. I kind of accept it, respect it, invite it. I think that's what's really going on at the center of the change grid. And why am I saying that? But because at the center of the change grid is where we can begin to dissociate from what's going on. And I think that sometimes people think that tolerating is about you separating yourself from whatever the dynamic is that's going on. So you're not speaking up, you're putting up with whatever's going on. Well, in the center of the change grid, you can now go, oh no, I can actually dissociate here. I can float above this whole situation and observe it as a detached party. Very much care about what's going on, but I can kind of see what's really going on. And I think that's our role when we're brought in as a moderator, a mediator, whatever. Okay, anyone want to throw something out there? I just saw something pop up in chat. So yes, getting a yay. Thank you so very much. So yeah, so Tim, oh no, that was Tim's comment. I think that's the whole idea. When we're saying like, we got to get people to the table's inside of the green circle. So when we say things like we got to help people to find common ground is found inside of the green circle. Now, that would then mean that there is going to be a certain way that tolerance comes into play. Thank you, Adobe, but no. Remind me later. There's a certain that's going to come into play between the green circle and the red circle. Because we've already talked about what happens in the danger zones. Well, how does tolerance express itself between the green circle and the red circle? Anyone want to have?
I think maybe it's a little bit of frustration.
It can be. Do you think that frustration? Well, no. I think you're right. But how about expressed frustration versus internalized frustration? Might that appear in different places around the change grid?
Your amiable driver is going to be a lot more coy about the situation than your driven driver, certainly.
Yeah, yep. And so, and even as I move down grid, I would say that the person, as we start to move down grid, they become increasingly less likely to speak their frustration, even though they're feeling it. They might start off putting forth a case, but as they move from putting forth a case to just shutting up because they realize it's not going to make any difference, somewhere along the line, they're still experiencing the frustration. Yeah, but they're subordinating it, or they're not really expressing it as fully as they otherwise would. Yeah, they're shutting up because they're putting up. Yeah. All right. So I kind of think that we encounter a lot of people who are in the expressed frustration that tends to occur more up-grid and out-grid. Frustration is actually outwardly expressed. And I think that the frustration that is down-grid and in-grid is more internalized. And so we would say then that the people that are down-grid are going to be quietly tolerant, and the people that are up-grid and out-grid between the green and the red circles are going to start to express their lack of tolerance. So
well, that's terrible, T, because most of the organizations, if I think back to plotting them, a lot of them were down-grid to begin with.
Oh yeah. I've said for many, many years now that the world of business seems to think that stress is one of their biggest problems, and I've always said no, it's apathy. Apathy is quiet, and it doesn't draw attention to itself. Or the people that are in grid who are now too timid to step up and step out. This is what happens as you get these more up-grid. Up-grid people I personally find exhausting to be around. And so all this very expressive, everyone wants to be all that kind of stuff that comes with that, I find it very draining to even witness, let alone be around. And then the people that are very far out-grid, we already know what impact they have. If they're in this out-grid danger zone, we already know what impact they have on other people in their organization, and etc. So yeah, David, I think you're absolutely right. These people plot very much down grid, where it is this tolerance. Who brought up that tolerance is, is that the reward? Yep, we find them tolerable. I can handle this. I can deal with this. That's all expressions of tolerance. It's down grid. Yeah. So what if these people suddenly, I don't want them to suddenly become intolerant and move into the up-grid danger zone or in the out-grid area, but can we at least get them in the circle where they will express what their thoughts are? Share their perspective. I mean, we all can learn from one another. And that means if we're at the table, if we're inside of that circle, it's important that we as facilitators make sure that every single person has expressed themselves, feels comfortable expressing themselves, knows that their contribution is valued. Maybe then we can have these quieter ones speak up and these more expressive and driven ones chill out.
And T, I would say that inside that circle is where level 4 and 5 of the tolerance scale would be, which is acceptance and appreciation.
Acceptance and appreciation. And again, that's a goal to work towards, right? I mean, it's not assumed that, well, maybe some people walk into the discussion already there, but isn't really the dynamic that everyone can be moved along the scale. And we need to move them in that direction in order to have good things really happen in a productive, respectful sort of way.
One reason why a company-wide change grid from time to time is advisable.
Yeah. Yeah, because it can definitely give you a glimpse into what lurks beneath. Yeah.
Mhm.
Now, I'll add one more element to this whole thing and say to you that depending on the scenario that we're looking at, where this dynamic may come into play and we want people to move to the middle, there are always people, generally out-grid, who desperately want to keep you away from the middle. Because what's the problem? What's the dynamic between an out-grid danger zone individual and what do they view this green circle as representing to them?
It's a threat.
It's a huge threat. It's a huge threat. And so when I say, what if we as a culture, as a society, as a family, as a whatever level you want, what if we all just became really good at being inside of the green circle and being understanding and not tolerant. Well, tolerant is the introduction. That's when you first step in, you're tolerant. But now we become more respectful, more honoring, more inquisitive, all those good sorts of things. What if everybody lived in there? What would our society look and feel like? Compared to one where whoever it is that's doing shame-shifting maneuvers on us doesn't want us there. They want everyone to not be there. So be down in
1950, T, 1950.
Tell us about 1950.
Well, it was after the war and the economy was booming and we were creating all kinds of new products that was making life a lot easier. And there was certainly, ills. The country had ills and bad things were going on, but I would just from a societal standpoint. So it just seemed like everybody was more focused on improvement and expansion than contraction or war, which is what they've been through.
Yep. And so goal is, if I want to control you, manipulate you, you can't be here. Because here is your greatest place of security, right? Greatest place of, and I'm not talking about security as far as defending yourself, other than the thought that the truth will set you free. This is the domain where there is a balance between an appreciation for the facts, an appreciation for one another, and an appreciation for the needs of self. So we talked about being information-oriented, other-oriented, and self-oriented. Those exist in complete balance and harmony. And the center of the change grid. And so inside of the green circle, we still have relative balance and harmony going on among those three. As you start to move away, or if someone starts to move you away from that green circle, your appreciation for the facts or your honoring of the facts starts to fall by the wayside. These people don't want you to look at the facts. Because as Filene said, I don't know if you know about the work of Edward Filene, but he did a whole lot of very interesting, for the time, highly progressive insights in the world of managing others and lots of other things along that line. But one of the things that he said was that if you stay focused on the facts, they will always lead to the truth. And so where's the appreciation for the facts? It's inside of this green circle. Once we start to move, by the way, people that are very far down grid will tell you with every syllable they utter that everything they're saying is factually true. But what's the difference between their facts and the facts we find in the center? Any thought?
T, I would think it'd be an openness, that in the center, you've given up the need to be right so that you can make a better decision by hearing viewpoints.
Exactly right. Yeah, because facts are part of an evolutionary process. The further downward you go, the more rigid you become about the facts. X is true. But the world keeps changing. And as the world keeps changing, additional facts come into play. And sometimes those facts actually now reveal evidence that calls formerly strongly held beliefs about something being factual into some sort of a question mark. And I'm going to give you an example of this that struck me very much yesterday. So I tend to be compliant by nature. I'm okay with that. If someone wants me to wear a mask or maintain social distance, I'm more than happy. I'll put on a mask and I'll maintain social distance. My personal beliefs about it are irrelevant. I'm compliant by nature, so happy to do it because bottom line is fine. But this one idea really struck me yesterday about this 6 feet of different, that 6 feet would matter. I always thought, well, 6 feet is better than being in your face. But I don't think 6 feet is enough distance if the whole goal is get out of the viral cloud. Okay. And what happened yesterday was I was outside. I'd gone to the market and I'm coming out. I'm walking to my car and all of a sudden I smell cigarette smoke. And I look around me and I cannot see where this is coming from until I notice that a good, I'm going to say not less than 20, 30 feet away from me is someone smoking. Now, if smoke particles, which are actually quite heavy, can be perceived or received by someone 30 feet away, why do I think that some submicroscopic particle like a virus might go further than 6 feet? And so I go like, well, now that's kind of like a different way of looking at the fact. And so did the fact change? Well, if they said the fact is that you're better off being 6 feet away, well, maybe the revised fact is you're better being, as far away as possible from wherever's going on. So I'm babbling, but I just put that out there just to kind of go like, why would anyone think that if they're staying 6 feet away from somebody, they're out of the viral cloud when they can smell someone's smoke from, across the parking lot? So what's the difference? The difference is that the virus isn't heavy. And so it's going to stay aloft far longer than a smoke particle would. Okay, anywho, there you go. All right, so yes, go ahead.
So T, could you opine on something for me you mentioned earlier? You said that in many instances, you're finding organizations think they're more in stress in terms of their issues, but they're more downgrid.
Yeah.
Right. And
yeah.
Do you see that as being different based on the size of organizations? Larger companies tending to be more downgrid and the issues that they face as opposed to smaller companies being more upgrid?
Yeah, but rather than tie it to overall organizational size, I would want to tie it more to the number of individuals a given manager is supposed to manage. So in a small organization, I need a manager, but I might have a manager and there's only 4 sales representatives, but I still have a sales manager. Well, they can kind of do a better job of observing what people's productivity may be or what their issues are, or whatever, because there's less of it to do. But let's say I'm in a large corporation and suddenly I am several levels removed from the people that I'm supposed to be managing or whatever. There ends up being more and more of a possibility that people can slip under the radar. And if you add to that the larger the organization, the more likely their idea of performance appraisal tends to be an annualized kind of a thing, then you kind of know, like, no one's even going to notice me as long as I maintain a reasonable level of performance against whatever metrics are being measured against, then no one's going to give me anything. And then add to that people pay attention to where they find their tension. So in a larger organization, there's all kinds of stuff going on that is distracting people from the task of observing what's really going on with their human assets. So I do believe in a larger organization, there will be more people moving downgrid unnoticed. Yeah. And that's the whole problem, because when you think about people being that far downgrid, in order for them to end up that far downgrid, the organization has already made a massive investment in bringing them on board, training them, supporting them, helping them to, one way or another, develop that perceived level of ability. And they've had enough of history that their perceived level of challenge is quite low now. So this is the worst part of the whole dynamic, is that not only do organizations have a very high percentage of their human capital operating downgrid, but it's operating downgrid because the company made it that way. So this is the result of what the company has sown. And so if the company had done what we would be advising, and that is that it's much easier to keep someone out of apathy than it is to get them out of apathy, then they would have been doing continuous appraisals, as David was pointing out, doing ongoing change grids, just to make sure that the level of challenge was always kept high enough that the person was engaged, that they were always being exposed to things where additional learning is necessary, additional skill development is necessary. That would keep them here on the change grid, even if on the downgrid side of engagement and execution. So I'm happy there. I'd like you to be in the middle, but things are better here. Yep.
I saw an article today that said the number one reason for turnover in the country is no longer the boss, but a lack of development.
Yeah. People get bored. And they get bored fast, and I have no opportunity to develop until a new mission, vision, purpose, challenge has been introduced. And if I'm being ignored, then the burden is being placed on me as that ignored individual to come up with my own new vision, my own new mission, purpose, my own new challenge. And what percentage of the population is likely to do that? And so what ends up happening is that this massive investment that's made in human capital and bringing that capital up to speed is suddenly not developed any further, not leveraged any further. I've often thought if companies simply put a freeze on hiring and simultaneously we increased what their performance expectations were, would they meet that objective or fail? So you can't bring on more people. You got to work with the people that you have, and we'd like to see results increase by 10%. What do you think would actually happen?
They're going to fail.
You think?
I mean, they're doing it now for the pandemic has been an excuse, a valid one, but it's been an excuse for a lot of organizations.
Right. And so if they fail, what does that tell you about your leadership team?
They're probably down there with them in apathy.
There you go. They're not very effective, because I look at this and I go, like, if I was a manager and that's the situation I've been placed in, I know that everything we are looking for is waiting in the untapped potential of these downgrid individuals.
Yep.
If I can find some way to help these individuals get re-engaged with the work, if I can help them find some new mission, vision, purpose, or whatever. Unfortunately, what's been happening with the whole pandemic, and it's backfiring greatly, is people have been saying to them, you've got to do this, otherwise, you've lost your job. Really? You think it's easy to replace me? I'll find a job far faster than you'll find someone to take the job. So, and by the way, I'll probably get better working conditions and higher compensation.
AT?
Yep.
One thing that it's kind of important about what you said about moving people from downgrid, organizations from downgrid to mid or outgrid, or at least a little bit more upgrid, you got to be ready. You got to have plans in place. You have to have, you have to have thought this through. Otherwise, you're going to have a bunch of people bouncing around like BBs in a beer can.
It's true. It's true. And ultimately, it's going to get back to, we have to make sure that all of the management team and above is on board, that they understand that the reason why this whole dynamic occurred is because of the fact that these people have been ignored. The investment the company has already made has been neglected. In the world of agriculture, it's the equivalent of prepping the soil beautifully, planting everything beautifully, watering it, doing all that kind of stuff, and then never bother harvesting. So this is what it's all about. So I've often said to my clients, at least once a year for a period of 90 days, don't hire. Just say we've got to put our energy into developing our existing team members. In some larger organizations, they sometimes say, well, we need to now have two different teams. So one team that's responsible for recruiting for new positions, but we also need a team who's all about developing people in existing positions. And that's all fine, but those people that have now been brought on are now in the same department as the people who are already there, and they're all being managed by the exact same individual. So how long is it going to, people pay attention where they find their attention. My new hires need the attention. So they're going to get the attention, and that means the people who are been here for a good long while, veteran performers, they don't cause me any tension, so they're not going to get any attention.
Yeah, and to David's point, when I was designing HR software with a startup team, I think the research shows there was less than 4% of companies that actually model their workforce. Like they have, models for financials and those kinds of things. You talk about a good team, and you ask the question, what does that look like? They have no clue.
Yep. Well, in fact, we used to have someone on our team who had just completed her doctorate in human capital. And I guess there aren't, or there weren't at that time anyway, very many institutions across the US who even offered programs in this whole idea about human capital management. And that, but that's exactly what her thesis was about. So, how are we going to get that? Yeah, go ahead.
Quick question. So with that conversation in mind, what we're experiencing in a lot of companies right now, what people have coined the Great Resignation, right?
Yep.
What are your thoughts around that? Because I think there's a tie-in here for sure.
Well, there's a big tie-in. Certainly the change grid, again, I know that I'm the one who slapped this thing together, but because of this whole exercise in creating a circle of brilliance over all these years and merging all that brilliance, I think we have a tool here that does a pretty good job of explaining these seemingly random phenomena that's going on in all the business world. What I want to add to this particular discussion about the Great Resignation is what we've been talking about. In fact, Kathy might unmute on this one, about the spiral dynamic. I was listening to something on NPR that just said they made only passing mention of spiral dynamic, but they said that any kind of these highly disruptive events, and they were talking about wars being a disruptive event, certainly the pandemic is a highly disruptive event, has a tendency to accelerate the evolution of human values. And that now people, because of the pandemic, have realized that this quest for success in a business setting, this quest for titles, for the corner office, for whatever it happens to be, is relatively meaningless compared to spending more time with their family, enjoying their own space, and all that sort of a thing. And so I think that another thing that we're watching here is that next evolution, or that next rotation up the spiral dynamic has greatly been enhanced. So it changed our values greatly. And so I think that's what part of the resignation is all about. People are kind of going like, I no longer want or need to define myself by what I do for money. Mind you, Europe has been there for a good long while. That's very much in line with how a lot of European cultures think anyway. We're kind of going, there are more important things than what I do for a living, far more important things than keeping the boss happy. And so until the companies can adjust to accommodate and support that evolved set of values, this problem with hiring and retaining staff is going to become increasingly problematic for them. So the company has to change based on the changes of the individual. The company doesn't get to dictate, if they want to survive anyway, they don't get to dictate how people are going to value things going on in their lives. So we'll see which companies can do it and which companies will crumble and fall.
Interesting.
Yeah. Boris, more thoughts about that? And Brian, you've been up. Yeah, go ahead.
I think it's a very interesting perspective on this. And my view has been that there's been a sea change in the last decade or so towards what I consider this value creation conversation. And how
Yeah.
individuals want to be compensated for value creation, not for their time and effort.
Yeah, yep, I agree. And one other thing I want to throw in here about this whole situation that we're experiencing now is that this pandemic created a situation where people had to put working remotely and leveraging technology to the test.
Mhm.
And the test was successful. And so now people are kind of going, with obvious exceptions to the rule, they're kind of going like, why do I need to spend money on a wardrobe, to spend an unreasonable amount of time in a day, hours in my life traveling to a different place to sit in front of a computer? Can't I just sit in front of my computer at home, And they're realizing, they're learning, lo and behold, they can do that and do that very effectively.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, I mean, there's always going to be jobs where you got to get up and go, but this whole understanding of being able to work and work well from home is, thanks to technology, it was possible, but that ended up now creating an awareness, and not just an awareness, not just I imagine we could work from home. Nope, it's been proven. We can do it. We can do it quite well. And so, yeah, so there you have it. And what does that end up doing, by the way, to our planet? Less fuel being consumed, less traffic on the roads, less need for gigantic buildings. One of the things that we have been learning now in Arizona, particularly the valley, as we call this area of Arizona, we have a couple of massive new companies coming into play. Amazon's coming in with warehouses, and Tesla's doing something really major. I didn't realize that one of the biggest problem with massive size buildings is their water consumption.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, water is a big deal here. And so now they're wondering more and more and more, how can we bring in all that economic growth and somehow or another not end up in a survival issue when it comes to water, how water is used. And so now all these new plants have got to have all kinds of water recovery capabilities, all that sort of stuff going into it. But I never realized that the bigger the building, the more water comes into play. And it's not just water consumption, it's wasted water. So think about a gigantic skyscraper. How many gallons of water is just sitting in those pipes? Yeah.
If I can comment here too, just before we close, I think
Yep.
that, your point about we are definitely spiraling up, and a couple of points. The gap between those who want to stay with the status quo and those who do not is getting more and more apparent and visible. And hence there's a lot more conflict because of that in that process. But the other piece that I think is really fascinating from a systems perspective is that the things that you're talking about, all the different effects of, learning to work at home and the impact that that's having on infrastructure, is that these little pieces of the system and this are forcing that spiral up more quickly.
Yes.
A focus more on the environment, an understanding that we can be more creative about how we interact with the environment, and can focus more on relationship and actual caring for others in the environment as part of this upward spiral dynamic.
Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. So, yeah. Okay, well, we've gone over, but I think this has been a really good conversation. So I guess on Tuesday, we will begin our exploration of learning models. I will share with you one little slide that I wanted to show you. It's a link to a website called peakperformancecenter.com. I don't know anything about this company. All I know is that they have a page that lists out like 8 different models of learning, among them Gregoric and HBDI and a bunch of others, and they have all these comparisons. But I found their website to be extremely simple in the way that it is describing each of the different styles and how those styles come into play. So if you want to kind of do a little bit of a preview, if you just go to thepeakperformancecenter.com, thepeakperformancecenter.com, all spelled out, you'll find this page about learning styles. And that's where we're going to kind of use as our base reference as we start to work our way through Gregoric and a few other learning models, since they seem to be so similar with one another. I thought we might as well see, do they overlay on the change grid? How do they overlay, and why do we care? So, okay, with that, thank you all very much. This is a holiday weekend. Yeah, so have a wonderful Labor Day weekend, and we'll chat again on Tuesday. So bye, everybody. Take care.
Thanks to you.
Bye.
Welcome.
Bye.
Bye.
Happy holiday.